Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel for another true crime and makeup video. It's been a while since my last one, and honestly, I haven't done my makeup in weeks, so let's see how it goes today. We're just going to take it super chill. If you like true crime cases and makeup videos, please like this video and consider subscribing. Today, we're going to be looking at the life of Britain's most famous and most violent prisoner, Charles Bronson, aka Charles Salvador, aka Michael Peterson. Before we do start this video, I just want to say I've made this video from a collection of sources that I have found online. These sources are all linked in the bio, and I mean absolutely no disrespect when I'm talking about anyone in today's case. Let's get on with the video. I hope everyone's doing well. It's been a while, but I am hyped. This is a very interesting case, so I hope you enjoy. So Charles Bronson, he is known as Britain's most violent prisoner. He was actually born as Michael Gordon Peterson on the 6th of December 1952. So I'm just going to call him Michael for the time being because he didn't change his name until later in life. So he was known as Michael for most of his life, so I'm just going to refer to him as Michael for now. His parents were Ira and Joe Peterson, and he was the second of 3 brothers. And they lived in Luton in a very modest council house. His father, Joe, ran a decorating business, and the family were well known in the community. They were well liked. They were a respected family. Oh, I've done this completely wrong. You can tell I haven't done my makeup in ages because I haven't done my eyebrows first. I did think something was wrong. Anyway, when Michael was a young boy, he was described as a very loving boy. He was very nice, he was kind, he was very nurturing. His mother said that he loved nothing more than just going on little trips with his dad. They would go to the park, they would feed the ducks. He just loved spending time with his dad. He was just a normal, happy child. When Michael was a teenager, the family actually moved to Cheshire, and this is when Michael's criminal activities would start to begin. From a young age, Michael had brush-ins with the law, and when he was 13, police officers came around to his house because Michael and a group of his friends had been caught stealing some shoelaces and some shoe polish and hiding them in the shed, and they suspected the boys of this. They followed them to the shed and then they caught them. This was quite a bit of a shock for Michael's mum because he'd never really been in trouble before. This was the first thing. He was a very well behaved boy, and then he just started getting in some trouble. When Michael was at school, he didn't actually like being in a mixed school. He didn't like being in classrooms with girls, and he was honestly a bit of a nuisance. He was kind of like a class clown kind of guy, but he just wanted to rile up the teachers. He wouldn't do anything super bad, but he just would want to rile them up. Michael had a pretty good relationship with most of his family, and his aunt described him as just a nice child. She said he was bright, he was good with children. He was someone who wasn't a bully, but he defended the weak. So if he saw someone who was being beaten up, who couldn't stand up for themselves, he would jump in and he would beat up the kid who was being the bully. And this got him into a lot of trouble. He loved fighting from such a young age. He really enjoyed fighting. He liked fighting so much that he occasionally would try and fight the teachers, and he ended up actually getting expelled from school in Cheshire. When he was 15 years old, he decided he was going to get a fresh start and he was going to go and live with his grandmother in Liverpool, in Merseyside. His best friend when he was younger was a guy called John Bristow, and he said that the only trouble that they really used to get in was they used to sneak behind the backs of shops and steal bottles of pop, and then they would go back into the shop and return them for money. But that's the most they ever did. His first ever job was at Tesco's, but it didn't last particularly long because after 2 weeks he was fired for attacking his manager. He went on to work in a lot of labour intensive jobs. He worked in a lot of factories, things like carrying bricks and stuff. The first ever time he was imprisoned was in HM Prison Risley, which is in Cheshire, and he was arrested because he smashed some parked cars after having an argument with his girlfriend's dad. After a trial, he was fined and given probation. They're not the best eyebrows, but it's been a hot minute since I've done them. He was working as a furniture remover at one point, and he would regularly fight on his nights out. He was involved in some petty crime and got into trouble with the police again after he stole a lorry and crashed it into a car by accident. Luckily, the driver survived, so Michael was fined and once again put on probation. One night, Michael and his friend John, when they were older, they went to a pub called the Bull, and they got talking to these two girls. Michael was talking to this woman called Irene Kelsey, and they ended up dating, or courting as they called it back in those days. Irene Kelsey described Michael as just being a gentleman. He was always opening car doors for her. He was super protective of her. She said he was funny, just a lovely guy, and they eventually ended up getting pregnant. Michael was absolutely over the moon about this. He was so happy, and he was like, I'm gonna stop doing the crime stuff, I'm gonna stay out of trouble, I wanna help bring up this family. I want us to have a family together. So 8 months later, in 1972, when Irene was 4 months pregnant, both of them got married. They got married at Chester Registry Office. And then later, they ended up having a baby boy together who they called Michael Peterson. But this was Michael Jonathan Peterson. Our Michael, Charles Bronson, he was Michael Gordon Peterson. And for a couple years, Michael did settle down. He helped Irene raise the baby, and he was there. He was a good husband. He was a good father. After a couple of years, Michael got into binge drinking. He would basically go out on an evening. He'd be like, I'm gonna go drinking, and he would go out, and then he would not come back for 4 or 5 days. As this was happening, obviously him and Irene would have a lot of arguments. They would row all the time, and they were just slowly drifting apart in their marriage. It got to the point where Michael was hardly ever home anymore, and Irene later said this was because he was planning an armed robbery. When Michael was 21 years old, he took part in an armed robbery with a few other guys, where they went into a garage, and they robbed it, and Michael was the person who was carrying the gun. He carried the gun, no shots were fired, no one was injured, but he was, sent to trial and sentenced to prison for 7 years. His mother went to see him in prison, and she said he was just truly devastated, but he said, don't worry, I'll be out soon. His solicitors told him that if he behaved himself in prison, he should be able to get out in about 3 years, which can I just say is kind of ridiculous that someone can be sentenced to prison for a certain amount of time but could come out so much sooner. He was sentenced to prison for 7 years, but he was expected to come out in just 3 years for doing an armed robbery. I know an armed robbery isn't as bad as murder, but I just think that's crazy that you can do that. When Michael was in prison, he actually found it just impossible to cope. And little did he know he would continue to spend the majority of his life in prison. Spoilers. He was sent to this prison in Liverpool called Walton Gaol. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say it. And within 6 months, he'd already started to take his frustrations out on the other inmates and prison guards. He broke a man's nose and ribs, and then a few days later, he attacked another man who he believed was a grass or a snitch. And then Michael assaulted 2 police officers with a stick. He was then beaten, and he was put into solitary confinement, and 6 months were added to his sentence. He was transferred to Hull Prison in 1975, and he actually smashed up a workstation after having an argument with a police officer or a police warden. He was once again sent to solitary confinement. Solitary confinement, by the way, in case anyone doesn't know, this is a place where you go and you literally spend 24 hours just in a cell, in a very small cell, no windows. There's just nothing. It's just a room, a very, very small room, which you're in for days. He was also injected with this sedative called chlorpromazine, which made him violently ill, and another 6 months were added to his sentence. Not for the sedatives, 6 months were added because of this workbench that he just completely wrecked. Because I've not done make him so long, I might just do a very simple, natural kind of thing. Okay, so once Michael was better from these sedatives, he would still continue to be violent, so he was kept in solitary confinement for several more months, just in this room for several hours a day, just doing nothing. In 1976, Michael's wife, Irene, she was just done. She didn't want to be part of this life. Like I said, they'd already been drifting apart, and even if he wasn't in prison, they probably would have separated. So they ended up getting divorced. Michael continued on his spiral of violence, even glassing another inmate at one time with a jug. Apparently he did this because the inmate was like banging on the ceiling of Michael's room just like constantly, and it really annoyed him, so he glassed him. And I mean, like, you know, fair enough, if he's in there all the time and he's just banging, he's probably very annoyed at that, so, you know, fair enough. Anyway, another 9 months were added to his sentence. These sirens, Manchester, we get them all the time. Okay, so after that, he was actually transferred to a prison in Leeds called Army Gaol, again, I don't know how to say it. When he got to Leeds, he discovered he had a little bit of a reputation for being a very violent inmate, and all the inmates knew him, and, you know, he was like famous. During 1975 and 1977, he was switched between several prisons, including Armley, Wakefield, Pankhurst, and Walton prisons. I think Walton Prison is in London, so when he was taken from Yorkshire to London, he was actually like chained down to the floor of the prison van, so he couldn't hit anyone. Why does this side look so much better than this side? Because Michael was such a violent prisoner and just such an aggressive prisoner, he would spend the majority of his time in solitary confinement in all of these prisons he was in, and he would just work out all the time because he was so bored, and he kind of like started a fitness program to stay fit, like his own cell fitness program. He still continued to attack prisoners and damage prison property whenever he was let out, meaning that he would just go straight back into solitary confinement. When he was at Wandsworth Prison in London, he actually attempted to poison the prisoner in the cell next to him. I don't know what with, but yeah. He was moved to Pankhurst Prison in 1976, which is on the Isle of Wight, and this is where he befriended the famous Cray twins. He describes them as the best two guys he's ever met. The Cray twins were famous brothers who were like famous British criminals of organised crime in London during the 1950s and 60s. And they were involved in all sorts: murder, armed robbery, arson, assaults, just like all that stuff. Anyway, he was there for a bit, but then he was moved back to Wandsworth Prison soon after threatening to kill a prison guard. He then spent 4 months in isolation and was even caught at one point trying to dig himself out of his cell. When Michael was allowed back into the general prison population, he actually attacked the guy who told prison guards of his like plan to dig out of his cell. This apparently scarred him for life. I don't know like how exactly it did. I don't have the exact information, but apparently it did. This makeup is just... We'll just keep going. So the governor at Wandsworth, he wanted Michael gone. Every prison he went in, he was just so aggressive and just such a difficult prisoner that like no prisons wanted him, and the only place that was actually willing to accept him was the C unit at Pankhurst, which was the psychiatric wing. So Michael again was back on his merry way to the Isle of Wight. He would just like move around all the time to so many different prisons, which was probably very infuriating. He attacked a prisoner with a jam jar, which he was charged with. He also attempted suicide, and he attacked a police officer. So then so much had happened, they'd really tried with him, so they decided to send him to Broadmoor Hospital. If you haven't heard of Broadmoor Hospital, it's a very famous psychiatric hospital in Britain, known to have some very famous criminal patients, some of which including Peter Sutcliffe, who is the Yorkshire Ripper. The Cray twins went there as well, just to name a couple. So he was fine at Broadmoor for a while. It was like a little bit more chill, but they would give him drugs all the time, which would like sedate him, and would just make him, like, not himself, would just kind of, like, knock him out of it. They were just doing it to, like, keep him under control, but, you know, he didn't like this. I don't think anyone would like it. His mother said they went to see him 1 month and he was absolutely fine, just his jolly old self. And then the next month they went and he was just a completely different person because of these drugs he was on. If he didn't take the drugs willingly, they would be forcibly administered to him. Most of the time he'd be drugged, and then before, you know, he wouldn't be drugged anymore, they would just give him drugs. So he was just in this perpetual state of being drugged. If Michael was ever aggressive, they would just inject him with this tranquilizer. It was called liquid cosh, and it just had the worst side effects. Side effects like your whole body just like seizing up or going into like spasms and fits. You'd become paralyzed from it. It would make you have like lockjaw, so your jaw like wouldn't be able to move. You would wet yourself, like you couldn't help it. He was eventually transferred to another hospital, this being Rampton Secure Hospital. It was a high security psychiatric hospital. Words. And he really did not like it here. He did not like he would have preferred to be at Broadmoor than this hospital. It was that bad. He even stated later, "I witnessed them running into walls, using their heads as rams. I've seen them fall unconscious doing this. They stabbed themselves with pens, needles, scissors. One even blinded himself in one eye, and another tore out his own testicle. There was one just kept trying to eat himself, biting his arms, legs and feet." So yeah, he was not having a good time at this place. He really didn't like it. While he was there, he attempted to strangle child sex murderer John White. However, he was apprehended from doing so, and shortly after that returned to Broadmoor Hospital, where his friend Ronnie Cray was reunited. Aside from Ronnie Cray, Michael found it difficult to mix with other inmates. He didn't really like anyone. He just wanted to be kind of left to himself. One day, him and Ronnie were just like sat next to each other watching TV, and this inmate was just like staring at him, and he was like, "Dude, what do you want?" And this prisoner was like, "Will you do me a favour?" He said he wanted to hit him because he liked people hitting him. So Michael hit him under his chin and then just kept on punching him. In the end, he lost 3 teeth, he had a fractured jaw, and he had to have 12 stitches in his eye. And as soon as he came back around, he was just like, "Oh, that was lovely." While he was at Broadmoor, Michael tried to strangle another patient, this time someone called Gordon Robertson. I think he wanted to kill someone because he wanted to get out of like a psychiatric hospital. He wanted to go back to normal prison. Even though like he was clearly struggling, he would rather be in a normal prison for murder than be in like a psychiatric institution or something. He was becoming very depressed at this time, but his spirits were lifted when his friend Ronnie Cray actually arranged a visit from a famous boxer called Terry Downs. Like I said earlier, Michael was really into boxing and fighting. Like that's what he really enjoyed doing. He was really good at it. So this was probably something really exciting for him. He probably felt like a little bit famous. In 1982, Michael actually kind of escaped from Broadmoor, and he actually like made it to the roof of the hospital. He did this in a protest, basically saying that, you know, the living conditions were terrible. He was super unhappy and he was protesting to be sent to a prison in Liverpool. You know, he was like saying the prisoners were treated bad with the drugs and the confinement and just like the general mental health. It was probably like very low. He was the first prisoner to get onto the roof of Broadmoor in 100 years. He tore off like loads of news tiles and he made the news, like the news went and were like filming him, and he caused £250,000 worth of damage to the hospital. And he was up there for 3 days doing a 3-day protest, and the only way they could get him down was his family came and like convinced him to come back down. Eventually, Michael was moved from Broadmoor back into the mainstream prison system, and his attacks just continued. He used a sauce bottle to stab an inmate called Mervyn Hawley, who had made sexual advances towards him. He was returned to the general prison population at Risley Remand Centre in 1985, but then he was placed in isolation after punching a fellow inmate. An additional 3 years were then added onto his sentence. This meant more long periods of solitary confinement, and again, like I said, he'd be in there for like 24 hours a day for months. His original sentence should have been about 3 years, if he'd have behaved, and in 1987 he had been there for 14 years. He was then moved back to the Isle of Wight to Albany, where on his first day he punched another inmate. After that, he was moved to Wormwood Scrubs in Hammersmiths, but he strangled the governor there. He didn't kill him, he just strangled him. So 2 weeks later, he was returned to Wandsworth in London. In 1986, he was transferred a total number of 8 times, and the only new prison for him was Winchester Prison. The others he'd all been to before. On the 3rd of January 1987, he was transferred again to Gartree in Leicestershire, and this was actually where he would stay until he was released. So in 1987, he was released from Leicester Prison and he went to go and live with his parents in Aberystwyth in Wales. Aberystwyth. Sorry, I don't know how to say that either. They lived near the sea, and every morning at 6 a.m. Michael would go on the beach and do, like a morning run. He was like really into fitness. Obviously, during his time in solitary confinement, all he would do is work out. And, it was something that he really enjoyed, and he took this with him out of prison as well. Like, he wanted to stay fit, and he would, run all the time. He found it very difficult to adjust to life. He'd been in prison for quite a while, so when he came out, a lot of things were different. The money was different, and the roads, the traffic were different. He was just finding it a little bit tricky to adjust. But anyway, after 5 days of living with his parents in Wales, he decided he wanted to travel down to London because he found Wales too small, and I think he wanted to go back to Luton was his plan. So he got a train down to London, and when he was in London he bought a water pistol, and he kind of changed it so it looked like a gun, and then he threatened a stranger to drive him all the way to Luton, which he did. While he was in Luton, he embarked on a fairly short career as an illegal bare-knuckled boxer. So boxers, they have to wear gloves on them, but he would just punch with his bare fists. And he did this in the East End of London under the advice of his friend Ronnie Cray. When he was there, his boxing coach suggested that he should change his name to something a little bit more jazzy. So his coach suggested, why don't you change your name to Charles Bronson? Charles Bronson, he was a famous action actor back in there, but Michael had never seen a Charles Bronson movie, but he was like, yeah, sure, I'll change my name, even though I've never seen one of the films. So up until now, he'd been going by Michael Peterson, but now this was his fighting name. He was now known as Charles Bronson. Now, Charles Bronson, he would fight a lot of people, and it's even rumoured that he once killed a Rottweiler with his bare hands in a fight to win £10,000. Later, he said that this is something that he's not proud of because he really likes animals. He won a few fights, which didn't go too far because the prize money was kind of adequate, but a lot of the time he would be disqualified for kind of cheating. He would lose control, he would keep punching after someone was on the floor, or if there were only 3 rounds in a boxing match, he would continue to do a 4th round, which meant he was disqualified. And soon enough, Charles was broke. On New Year's Day 1988, he robbed a jewellery shop to make some money, and I think also to steal a ring for his girlfriend Alison at the time, but don't hold me to that, I'm not sure if that is 100% accurate. So he did that on New Year's Day, but then on the 7th of January of 1988, he was on his 69th day of freedom, and he was apprehended by police when he was on his morning run. When he was arrested, he was actually charged under his fighting name, Charles Bronson. And at that moment, he decided to completely give up the name Michael Peterson. He would be now known forever as Charles Bronson. So, he was back in prison. He was returned to Leicester Prison. When he was there, he once again tried to reach the prison's roof because obviously that worked really well for him at Broadmoor, but he was unable to do so. He failed and he was sent to Brixton Prison. When he was in prison, he wrote to a woman named Kellyanne Cook, and he had met this woman on his release into the world, and they were really good friends, and she would come and pay him visits in prison. And soon enough, he fell in love with this woman, and he actually asked her to marry him. He got her a ring, and they were going to get married, but the wedding never actually took place. He actually had a lot of female admirers on the outside of prison. People would write to him all the time, would confess their love for him. Bronson was placed in a top secure unit of Brixton Prison, where there were 16 prisoners. And in June 1988, he pleaded guilty to the armed robbery he did on the jewellery store, and he was sentenced again to another 7 years. When he was back in prison, his attacks and his protests were just becoming even more extreme than last time. He just got into so many situations, and he was transferred so many more times over the years. He would spend a lot of time over the years again in isolation for punching prisoners and prison guards. He threw water on a governor one time. Another time he ran riot in the nude, and he was clutching onto the spear that he'd made out of a broken bottle and a mop. One time when he was back at Pankhurst Prison, he was actually stabbed several times in the back by a couple of prisoners, and he was taken to hospital. Bronson straight out refused to reveal the identities of the prisoners who attacked him, and he just refused to talk about it to the police. I guess he didn't really like snitches and grassers, and he was like, I don't care if they stabbed me, I'm not gonna tell on them. Anyway, after that, Bronson was actually released from prison another time in November 1992. He was free for a total of 53 days before being arrested once again. This time for conspiracy to rob. So he didn't even rob, it was like a conspiracy to rob. He was taken to a newly opened prison in Milton Keynes called Woodhill, and he insisted to the police that the people who reported him, which was actually his girlfriend at the time, Kelly Ann, and then her friend, and then her friend's partner, lover, they were the people who had told the police of his conspiracy to rob, and he was like, I didn't do this. On the 9th of February 1993, the charges of robbery were dropped against him because, he didn't actually do it, but he was fined £600 for breaking someone's nose. 16 days later, he was actually arrested again for another conspiracy to rob and having possession of a sawn-off shotgun. When he was back in Woodhull Prison, this was when he took a civilian librarian hostage, and his demands in this hostage were an inflatable doll, a helicopter, and a cup of tea. He actually released the hostage when the librarian guy, broke wind in front of him, and he was just absolutely disgusted with this, so he let him go. When he was at his trial for the conspiracy to rob and having the shotgun, he pleaded guilty to possessing the shotgun, but not guilty for the conspiracy charges. He told jury he intended to use the gun to actually blow his own head off, not use it on anyone else. However, he was found guilty and he was given another 8-year sentence. He was then taken to Wakefield Prison, where he spent 40 days naked in isolation. I don't know if he just did that because he wanted to be naked, or if the guards didn't give him any clothes, but yeah. He was then transferred to Hull, and for a number of months he didn't do anything wrong, he had no incidents, but then one day he decided to take Deputy Governor Adrian Wallace hostage on Easter Monday of 1994. His family actually phoned him, I think it was his cousin that phoned him, when, he had this governor hostage, and he basically was like, come and visit me, and she was like, okay, I'll come and visit you, and then he let him go, and that's all he wanted, he just wanted to see his family. So I don't know if this is a cry for help or what, but that's pretty sad. He was overpowered by the guards and then taken to Leicester once again. He was then later returned to Wakefield, where he was confined to what is known now as the Hannibal cage, off the Hannibal film where he's in the middle of a room in a cage. Well, there was a murderer, a serial killer, who was in the exact same cage as him. What's he called? So there was a serial killer who's actually in the exact same cage as Charles Bronson before. He was called Robert Maudsley, and he was a serial killer who killed 4 people, and he was in this Hannibal cage, and then Charles Bronson was in it. He had spent a lot of time in solitary, like I'd already said, and at this point in his life he had spent around 22 years of his life in solitary confinement. This is one of the reasons why Charles Bronson started to wear the iconic sunglasses. After 22 years of solitary confinement, his eyes were so sensitive to light that he would have super intense headaches if he, wasn't wearing sunglasses. So he had to wear sunglasses at all times, and then this kind of became part of his iconic look, with the beard and the sunglasses and the mustache. He would spend countless hours bodybuilding in solitary confinement because He was just so bored, and he used to do like 1,000 press-ups a day, and it got to a point where he could even do 25 press-ups in a row with 2 grown men sitting on his back. Most of his time in prison, he was treated really badly by the prison guards. Like, yes, he would assault them, but equally, they would lock him in solitary confinement, and they would, like, bang on the door when he was trying to sleep at night, and they would turn the light on and off when he was trying to sleep, and they would beat him as well. There's a rumour that one time guards, like, ripped his mustache off his face, and they broke some of his fingers by stamping on him and kicking him. He was repeatedly kicked and bitten, and every single time he was outnumbered. It was always 6 men to 1, all of them just beating him. Which is, I know he's a very violent person, so I understand that, but they don't have to rip his mustache out. That seems a little bit excessive. He went to a prison called Belmarsh Prison, and this was probably the first prison where he actually had a positive interaction with prison guards. They let him play sports like badminton and like Scrabble, and they would like try and challenge him intellectually because he was a smart man and they knew he was a smart man. He even had a psychiatrist at one point. He was called Dr. Johnson, and he would help Charles try to like concentrate on his anger and get to the root of why are you angry. And Charles understood that if he stopped being aggressive, he realised this would be a good thing for him because he would be able to get out of solitary confinement because he didn't want to spend his whole life locked away in a cell. But he was like struggling with that. He needed help to understand like how to control it and how to not get so angry and worked up all the time. While Bronson was in Wakefield Prison at one point, 2 police officers, Mick Hagan and Alan Jarvis, they actually encouraged Charles to take up art, and he began to concentrate on like cartooning. And he actually really enjoyed this. This was something that he started doing, and he still enjoys it to this very day. Probably so much so that when people hear Charles Bronson, I think they think of like the iconic like look, because he's quite a unique looking man. So I think they think about how he looked, but then also they'll think about his cartoons and his drawings. In 1994, in September, Charles's father died, and this was during a period when Bronson was in solitary confinement, like constantly, and he was moved almost weekly to different prisons. And then a couple of years later, April 1996, he was sent back to Belmarsh, which was the nice prison, after taking a doctor hostage at Birmingham. Like, he did this quite a lot. He was very violent. He would attack people, but he also took a lot of people hostage over the years. 5 months later, there was an inmate at the prison who was an Iraqi hijacker, and he bumped into Bronson in the canteen, and he didn't say sorry. And this wasn't good for Charles. He got really annoyed about this. He was like, why didn't he say sorry? And he was like brooding over it for ages. And he decided to take hostage. I don't know how he did this, but he took 2 other Iraqi hijackers hostage with another inmate called Jason Greasley, and he took them hostage in a cell. He told them that he was losing it badly, and he would rant about his dead father, and he said that any funny business from them would result in him snapping their necks. He actually hit one of his hostages with a metal tray, but then instantly felt really bad about it. So he said, you can hit me over the head 4 times with this metal tray to call it quits because I feel really bad. He then slashed himself with a razor 4 times, and he agreed to release the hostages and return back to the segregation unit. And then another 7 years were added to his sentence. In 1998, Charles actually got in contact with one of his old friends called Ray Williams, and he wanted him to help him track down his ex-wife because he wanted to meet his son, Michael Peterson Jr. He'd not seen him in 23 years, and he just wanted to see him. So little Michael, he arranged to meet his father in Wakefield Prison, and they both had a very emotional experience meeting each other. They were crying all over each other, they were hugging each other. Charles said how proud he was of his son, of the boy he'd grown into, and Michael was just overwhelmed with how nice his dad was. Michael was kind of going down that route of like being a bit of a bad un, getting into like sort of stealing things, and he said that meeting his dad, he promised him like, I'm not gonna go down that path, I'm gonna like be good, I'm gonna sort myself out, and he did. He never got in trouble or anything. He was like a good kid. And then Charles promised to Michael I'll be good, I promise I'll stay out of trouble. But of course that didn't happen. In January 1999, Charles took a civilian education worker called Phil Danielson hostage, as he had kind of criticised one of Bronson's drawings, which Bronson didn't like. He tore up the prison. He was throwing refrigeration units, he was pulling out washing machines, he was throwing furniture around, and he forced the guy to watch this film called Dead Men Walking, which is about a prisoner who is on death row. And the whole time Bronson was just like, this is such an amazing film, I love it so much. And they just like sat there and they watched it, and this like siege lasted for 44 hours. After 44 hours, he released Phil and, you know, was like, go on your merry way, and he just legged it out of that place. He kept him for 44 hours because that was like the all-time hostage record, and he wanted to break the all-time hostage record. After the incident, he was transferred to Whitemoor, and during the trial he actually sacked his lawyers and he represented himself. His defense was that the system was actually to blame because prison had created him and made him into who he was. However, he was found guilty and he'd received a discretionary life sentence for a minimum of 3 years. In 2001, Charles surprisingly got married again to a woman called Fatima Sarah Raymond. I don't know if I've said that right at all. But they got married in Woodmill Prison. She had seen his picture and an article about him in the newspaper and had begun writing to him. And she visited him like 10 times before they got married. Before they met, she had worked in a women's shelter, but when her employer found out about her and Bronson's relationship, she lost her job. And for a short time, Bronson converted to his wife's faith of Islam. And again, for a short while, he wished to be known as Charles Ali Ahmed. But he didn't change his name legally, he just wanted to be known that while he was with his wife. After 4 years, him and Fatima divorced and he renounced Islam and he went back to just being known as Charles Bronson. In 2002, he actually published a book called Solitary Fitness, and it was all about an individual training process with minimal resources and space. This is where he talked about his 1,000 press-ups and being able to do 25 with 2 men on his back. During this period, Bronson tried to appeal against his life sentence, but 3 appeal court judges rejected the application in April of 2004. In 2007, 2 prison guards at Full Sutton High Security Prison, they were actually involved in a control and restraint incident with Bronson. It was an attempt to prevent another hostage situation, but during this time Bronson's glasses, his sunglasses, got broken, so he received a £200 compensation for his glasses. He remained a Category A prisoner and he was moved to Wakefield High Security Prison. In September of 2008, he was due a parole hearing, but this was postponed when his lawyer objected to like a 1-hour parole interview. He requested a full day to deal with Bronson's case. He was like, we're going to need a full day to go over this. We need more than 1 hour. So the parole hearing actually took place on the 11th of March 2009, but the board refused parole shortly afterwards. In August 2013, there was a petition with 10,000 signatures on it that was presented to 10 Downing Street calling for his release. Bronson actually wrote to David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time, appealing to him, saying that he wanted to live what was left of his life, not to be buried in the prison system. However, less than a year later, on the 28th of February 2014, Bronson attacked the prison governor in like a television room in Woodhill Prison over a dispute that his mail was being like withheld for him, mail involving 2 letters from his mother that he hadn't received. The governor suffered serious bruising, but other than that he was fine. In July of the same year, Bronson was sentenced to another 2 years for, hurting this governor, and the prison accepted that his mail may have been unacceptably processed. So yeah, he wasn't getting his mail. So in August of that same year, Bronson announced he was changing his name again via deed poll to Charles Salvador in tribute to the artist Salvador Dali. He obviously really liked art, he was like really into it. So yeah, that's his like legal name. Under this new name, he decided to create different types of art. He would describe them as fantasy reality. A collection of these works were actually auctioned in October 2014. Then in 2017, Charles, he proposed to Coronation Street actress Paula Williamson during like a visit, and she accepted. She had been visiting him for 5 months, and yeah, they got engaged on the 13th of February 2017, and they were going to get married. She said Charles is a changed man. She said it was a hope for him to be released by August 2020 so he could be out and celebrate her 40th birthday with her, but that didn't happen. Charles and Paula actually married in the prison chapel on the 14th of November 2017, and then she went off to do the reception, but then he obviously had to stay in prison, so they hired like a lookalike to attend the reception for like the wedding photos, which is kind of weird because it really doesn't look like him. It just looks like someone who they've made bald with a moustache and sunglasses on. Anyway, this marriage was short-lived because in July 2018, Bronson discovered some pretty crazy photos of Paula just hanging out in Tenerife with like a young man like motorboating her chest, and then her like inviting like a group of young men like back to her house. So yeah, he divorced her. However, on the 29th of July 2019, his ex-wife Paula was found dead in her home in Stoke-on-Trent. She was 38 years old, and the police said her death was not suspicious. I'm not sure what happened to her, but yeah. Anyway, back in November 2018, Bronson was in Leeds Crown Court, and he was being tried for attempting to cause grievous bodily harm with intent. I presume this was to the governor. He told the court that for the first time in 44 years in prison, he had never intended to be violent, and he never meant to hurt the governor. He was found not guilty, and then he was moved to Her Majesty's Prison, Wood Hill, and then he would stay there to this day. He is still there right now. Since 1999, Charles has occupied himself by writing poetry, producing artworks. He's had 11 books published, including in 2008 his only self-penned book, Loonyology, My Own Words. He's also won 11 Koestler, I think that's how you say it, Trust Awards for his poetry and art. In 2016, he auctioned one of his artworks to raise money for the treatment of a child with cerebral palsy. And in 2009, a film was made about him featuring Tom Hardy called Bronson. It's a really good film. If you haven't seen it, I would suggest watching it. However, there was a bit of controversy around it at the premiere because there was a recording of Charles Bronson's real voice in the film, and this was played with no prior permission granted by any officers, and they called for an inquiry into like, how did you get this recording? However, Charles is on pretty good terms with Tom Hardy, and Tom even used to send him letters and cards and gifts and stuff. And Charles has even said himself that there is no better person to play him in a movie than Tom Hardy. So there you go. Like I said, he's still incarcerated in Her Majesty's Prison Wood Hill, which is in Milton Keynes as of 2021, and he's still fighting to be let out of prison to this day. I kind of hope so he can just have the last portion of his life in freedom. I don't think he's a bad guy. I think, yeah, he's had some violent streaks and he's done a lot of things, but I think he's a changed man, and I think he's a nice guy who got a little bit failed by the system. He's 68 years old now, and if he is released, he might seriously struggle to adapt to life. It's going to be so different from what he remembers, and it's so different to prison. It would be so alien to him. So yeah, that is everything. He's still in prison. He's still fighting to get out to this day, and I sincerely hope that one day he does. I think he's changed. He's not been violent or got into anything like that for quite a while now, and I just think the times he did do that, I think he was like a cry for help. I just thought that this was a very interesting person to do a video on. I did not know anything about Charles Bronson before I did this. I had watched the film, but that's not very an accurate depiction of his life. So I just wanted to talk to him about it, raise some awareness about him, and yeah, I just kind of feel really sorry for him, honestly. He's clearly had a rough life, and even though he was violent at first, I think he's changed. I think he's a nice guy. I think he's a kind person. Anyway, this has probably been a very long video. I have thoroughly enjoyed researching this case, talking to you about it. My makeup went a bit crazy, but that's fine. We're in a lockdown, it doesn't matter. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, thank you. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I guess I'll see you in the next video. Bye!